Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, India's transnational repression against the Sikh community has been widely recognised. And now, at last, it's the British government's turn to take it seriously. Despite being late to the party, they're now gathering evidence. The US Sikh community has just won its first case against the Trump administration to stop its ICE raids against Gurdwaras in certain areas. I hope this will now extend nationally. And as the third anniversary of the Ukraine invasion passes, Russia's historic ally India is still funding the war machine through its purchase of Russian oil despite international sanctions. And finally, we take a look at the history of the Sikh community in Australia. All this and more on today's show, but joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our viewers out there. Thanks for tuning in yet again. And again, we encourage you to share your comments with us and make sure you tell all your friends about us. We'd love to have them join the program. So remember to put your comments in there to join us so we can respond to them and get your friends in there to follow us as well.
Absolutely, please do. James and I together will be bringing you, as always, our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And yes, of course, we will be taking a look at lazy great comments, which will be filling up below the videos at the end of the show. So stay tuned for that. Right, James, let's get the show underway. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
It is a somber anniversary. It is the 3-year mark of Russia's full-blown invasion of Ukraine. Now, we know that there has been a lot of talk recently about whether or not there are going to be peace talks, including Zelensky and Ukraine and what they're going to take shape as Donald Trump seems to be taking the lead in forcing both sides to some level of negotiation. We don't know what that peace agreement would look like. In the meantime, though, of course, we know that there are continued air raids going on, drone strikes, among other things, throughout the country. And since the war started 3 years ago, the cities and towns throughout Ukraine have seen a mass exodus of people moving not only to the border communities, but right out of the country. Millions and millions of people have fled Ukraine since the start of the war. We know that hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives and countless others injured throughout this campaign. It has been really what we've always said about the history, Angus. When we talk about war, there are never any winners. And this is very true when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Russia, because both sides are suffering at the hands of this full-blown attack that's been going on for 3 years without break. Now, of course, as I said, Trump seems to be pushing both sides in a direction. Trump actually took a very monumental and historic step recently in the United Nations in voting with the other side. He voted in with Russia, with Iran, and with North Korea when it came to the UN resolution on Russia and their responsibility for this war. So what that says about Donald Trump at this point is really out to people to make up their own mind. But what I'm hoping that we're seeing is a strategy by the Trump administration to actually force the war to come to an end. With the lack of funding coming in from the United States and the lack of safety guarantees, of course, that puts a lot more pressure on Europe and on Zelensky to get this thing settled, because without the U.S. hand in there, it's going to make it much, much harder to continue it for another year, let alone 3 more years, where it just seems to be dragging out. So this could be a very instrumental point in this war, and it could be tough love by Donald Trump to try and put an end to the bloodshed. And with any luck, that is what it is. I don't understand what he is doing or his tactics, but at the end of the day, I really hope that it's part of his bigger plan to bring peace to Europe, and hopefully something for long-lasting peace, not something just for a short-term fix, but something long-term, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Angus, it's worth watching, but at this time, we just want to acknowledge the 3 years, the lives lost on both sides, and really just let Ukraine know that we are still there to support in spirit and with our thoughts and our prayers, because any life lost is a tragedy, and our thoughts go to all the victims of war, and those are victims on all sides, Angus.
Yes, this war actually has been, I mean, it is a terrible tragedy, and we mustn't forget that hundreds of thousands of young men and women, presumably, have died. For what? Once again, for a war. And unfortunately, the trouble is, and this actually is a great case in point of propaganda, and we often say when we talk about the Ukraine war, the first victim, of course, is the truth. And this is very much the case with this situation in Ukraine. This is not a black and white war, and the media, certainly here in the West, and I guess it's the same in North America, but certainly here in Europe, the media has been absolutely pouring daily this diet of propaganda about how black and white this war is. The heroic, noble, wonderful Ukraine against this evil tyrant Putin and the evil of Russia, the Great Bear. And it is absolutely far from that. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not this sort of wonderful, clean living, great nation, this noble nation. I mean, I'm using that as a generalization. Of course, the Ukrainian people are not to blame for this. But it was only a few years ago, certainly here in the UK, the British papers were labeling Ukraine as a Nazi hotbed of dreadful human rights abuses. I mean, it was even worse than we often accuse India, in fact, much worse than we often accuse India of doing. In fact, Ukraine really was far from this bastion of morality. It was actually quite the opposite. But of course, it suited the media, and it suited the government line that suddenly Ukraine became this sort of this good white witch, let's call it, against the evil of Russia. And of course, we mustn't forget that Russia, yes, Putin is totalitarian, there's no question, and democracy in Russia is very questionable, to put it mildly. However, we, and I say we, that is NATO and the European Union deliberately, and US foreign policy. This is another fabulously bad example of failed US foreign policy. They deliberately provoked Putin. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted Putin to invade Ukraine, so they did everything in their power to provoke him to do so. There has been this long-standing agreement, this sort of unwritten agreement, that Ukraine forms part of this buffer zone between Russia and the West, between Russia and NATO. And there was this agreement that NATO wouldn't push into Ukraine, but that is exactly what we've done, effectively through proxy, through this. Ukraine elected its democratic government about 10 odd years ago, and the European Union and the CIA, presumably, through its own underhand tactics, undermined that government and put Zelensky, their placeman, in place. And Zelensky's done everything in his power since he took power to provoke and assist this provocation of Putin to invade Russia. So lo and behold, the script was written, and Putin did exactly as was predicted. He invaded Russia. And it's interesting, James, you say there are no winners. Actually, I would just slightly disagree with that. There is only one winner out of this war, as in every single war. That is the war machine, the arms manufacturers, this great corporate industrial machine that generates the assets for war. They are the winners out of this, and I only need to use the phrase 10% for the big guy, which has been bandied around since the Ukraine war. Basically, there is this implication that the Biden family, and of course by extension many others, BlackRock, and well, you take your corporation choice, who are getting extraordinarily rich. I would say Zelensky will be getting very rich in this war. And I actually predict that when Zelensky is toppled, and he will be soon, I have no doubt, when Zelensky quietly disappears, he will re-emerge in a few years. There'll be some journalist investigating it. They'll find him living in a $10 million mansion somewhere, because I can guarantee that Zelensky will have bank accounts all across Swiss banks that will be bulging at the seams. So unfortunately, I have always seen this war as firstly this failure of US foreign policy and NATO's aggression, and I say this as a Westerner, it was NATO that created this, but Ukraine has been turned into this enormous giant financial laundromat where an awful lot of money, and I'm talking tens of billions of dollars, have been laundered. Western money have been laundered through Ukraine. There's enough on the internet for those of you interested in that whole sort of concept to support that theory. But ultimately, as we say, James, there are no winners apart from the industrial war complex. And in India, we talk about India. India's part in this war has been absolutely disgraceful. Of course, India has this historic tie with Russia, but India has been buying Russian oil. It's one of the very few countries on the planet, despite international sanctions trying to isolate Putin and trying to undermine his war machine. India has persistently and consistently buying Russian oil, and so Russia has been gaining currency to feed and pay its war machine. That is, again, a dark stain on India. So India has been helping fund this killing machine of Russia. So, James, as I say, it's and we come back to Trump. I'm not going to talk too long about Trump, but basically what I would say is one thing that Trump is achieving, despite all the criticisms, he is going to achieve peace, as he promised. And peace will come at a cost. It will come at a cost to Ukraine. Well, tough. Unfortunately, Ukraine is going to suffer from this. And Ukraine does need to repay. And again, I blame Zelensky to this. I did say against the mainstream at the very beginning of this war, Ukraine should stop this, do a deal. You're not going to win this war. You cannot defeat Russia. I'm sorry, whatever happens, you cannot beat Russia. So do a deal, find peace, because all that you're going to get out of this, you're going to lose this war, and hundreds, if not millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of young men are going to lose their lives. Here we are 3 years later, and lo and behold, my predictions come true, and they are going to have to do a deal. Well done to Trump, despite all everybody's saying he's raping Ukraine. No, he's a businessman. The US has paid nearly $500 billion feeding this war machine. They want something in return. That's taxpayers' money. If I was a US citizen, I'm saying, hang on, I didn't vote for this $500 billion of my money paying for this war that I didn't support. Well, Trump's doing exactly what a good leader should do. He is now winning 50% of Ukraine's mineral rights going forward, in the past and going forward, to repay that $500 billion. And Europe is standing up saying, this is outrageous. You can't rape Ukraine's resources. Well, yes, he can. And he's done that. He's done that on behalf of the US taxpayer. He's getting what's called value for money. What are the European leaders doing? They're all running around twiddling their thumbs, all squealing like little rabbits, saying, oh, what about our share? What's Trump doing? Well, all I can say to the European leaders is, where's our value for money? I didn't vote for to spend all these tens of $billions in the Ukraine war. I actually wanted the Ukraine to do a deal at the beginning to save all these lives. I didn't support a big financial laundromat. And I certainly want you, as our European leaders, to bring peace. You've been spending 3 years talking about it. You haven't brought peace. Trump's bringing peace. And by the way, where's our share of the mineral rights? I don't see you doing anything for our return on investment. That's what it comes down to, James. It's ruthless, it's harsh, but that's the way of the world, James, unfortunately. So there you go, a bit of a Ukraine rant, but my feelings hopefully are very clear now.
And that's something that we spoke about last night as well. It kind of carried over the theme that war and empires and all of this takes a lot of ruthlessness. And we talked about that last night. So it's a part of history, no matter how far you go back or how far you go into the future. I mean, we can hope and try to prevent such, tragic and such catastrophic loss in the future. But at the end of the day, human beings are going to be squabbling, they're going to be fighting, and there's going to be wars into the future. And they may look different, but they still will have impact on daily lives. So, we'll see how that plays out. And as I said, we all know my thoughts on Trump, but on this one, I have to say that I'm hopeful that he actually has a plan, and I'm confident that there is something behind the madness to try to prevent this war from going another 3 years. And I think that he is trying to find that ground because, let's face it, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And nothing over the last 3 years has produced any results. So, it's time to take it in a different direction. And let's hope that works, Angus. It's, sad, but that's the way it's got to be, right? But with that, we will move in a different direction. I thought that because we have such a diverse audience, and we do have audience members in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, US, even people who have responded from other countries around the globe. And we love it. We're so proud to have all of you joining us day after day. And we've done some history of the Sikhs in Canada, Sikhs in the US, in the UK, but we haven't done a great deal of the history of Sikhs in the Australia region. We've covered a bit of New Zealand, but not much of Australia. So we thought we would do that tonight and just kind of take you along on a quick little journey because we are limited by time. But if you go back as far as the early 1800s, you'll find a history of the Sikhs in Australia and where they have brought that. And bear with me one moment. We seem to have technically lost that there. Oh, there we go. We're back. Okay. So here we have, going back, some beautiful old photos of different images. Now, when the Sikhs first started going into Australia, they were instrumental in building up different parts of business and different parts of reaching remote communities that maybe didn't have the access to trade and to the markets that they traditionally had. They also didn't have a lot of routes opened up, and that's where the Sikh community came in, and they started to actually be instrumental in the infrastructure that made traveling to these remote communities much easier. But also, even though they were easier than they traditionally had been, they were still rough roads and they were still very remote. But the Sikhs began what they called hawkers and peddlers, and they would take their carts, they would be horse-drawn, and they would go out for days, weeks, or even just continually, and they would swap items along the way, and when they'd get to the remote communities, again, they would do the trade. And these were areas that were not really highly paid or rewarding jobs to have, but at the same time, they were a necessity that the Sikhs filled that and brought that level of trade and help, because they also brought medicines, and it might not be the same type that we see today in the pharmacies, but it was very instrumental in the lives of those people in the remote communities. And when they arrived, and we're talking the late 1830s in that region there, but as they went on, they were also working in different areas such as cameleers, and that was a lot of actual Sikhs coming in from areas of Afghanistan and other regions, and they really brought up that area as well. So they were instrumental to that regard. During the time changes, there was what they called the White Australia policy, which led to a really, really tough time for the Sikhs in Australia. And the White Australia policy went from about 1901 to about 1973. And essentially it was brought in to really suppress the opportunities of different nationalities, the non-whites or the non-Europeans. And although it was really, really tough on the Chinese, it was also very limiting and very restricting on all other ethnicities as well, of anything besides non-European or non-whites. Now, that placed great restrictions, and then there was the levies and taxes and such that people were charged when they were in the nation. And here in Canada, we had something similar that was called the Chinese head tax. And we've talked about that before as well, but that went up into even the 1970s, the early 1970s, when that finally started to ease up. And since that time, of course, the Sikhs were really, prior to that time, they were instrumental in building the nation. They were instrumental in building infrastructure, but they were also instrumental in joining into the military and fighting side by side with all of the other Australians and the British in the different wars. And individuals such as Ganesa Singh, Trooper Dasanda Singh, Trooper Sardar Singh, and Private Singh, who served in the Australian Imperial Force, demonstrated courage and commitment to this, to the regiments and to the military, and that really paved a way for future Australian Sikhs of the future. And they still have that legacy today, that they gave that sense of community, that sense of of pride, that sense of ownership to a community that had been oppressed for so long. And there have been other Sikhs who really were instrumental in the governing of Australia over the years. And, there's a diplomat who served as Australia's High Commissioner to India and currently serves as Australia's High Commissioner to New Zealand. And that's Harinder Sidhu. And she actually, and I did say she has actually just exemplified the growth and the presence of Sikhs in Australian political life and public life. So it's really, really interesting to see how that's grown and developed. You have people like the Grewal brothers who run a successful wheat and flour milling business. They are very big in the Australian country, and they also are big in exporting as well. And so when you look at people such as Baba Ram Singh, who is credited with bringing the first Guru Granth Sahib to Australia, there's just been key people along the way that have just made their little piece of history that together has developed into something massive and something huge. And of course, that is why we've seen, such a big increase in the Sikh community in Australia. And it represents about 1% of the total population, but that is a big advancement from where they were and what they went through in all of those struggles. And there was racial profiling. There was, just so much against them, but they fought, they overcame, and they made their presence known now. And well into the future, they will be recognized for all of the major contributions that they made to developing Australia into the nation that it is today, Angus.
Fantastic, isn't it? I mean, we say this regularly. The diaspora, which has grown for, literally hundreds of years, they've gone to all these, I'd say, far-flung places. I'm sure the Australians hopefully don't get offended by that. But they go to these incredible places that actually at the time were deeply pioneering. Canada at the time was a pretty tough environment to make a living. But Australia, this is the nation that we here in the UK, we used to send our convicts over to Australia because it was the most godforsaken, beautiful now, but in those days it was a really pioneering place to build a life and make a living. And you've got to really take your hat off to the Sikhs from those days, in the early days of the diaspora in Australia, to have gone to a country like Australia that has so many natural challenges, not least everything that moves or crawls there wants to kill you or eat you. They actually managed to build these lives like they have done all over the world. And again, it's just such a testament to the spirit, the strength of character, and of course the philosophy of Sikhi that allows and creates these pioneering individuals to go to these places, build a life, and build a successful life. I mean, how many successful stories of Sikhs within the diaspora have we covered, James? It's just astounding. And I also, when we look at these photographs of these old Sikhs from these days past, and unfortunately there are not many around, but those that you do see, they are all these magnificent characters, very proud, stout, solid characters, always beautifully presented, very proud of their appearance. And it really is, it just makes such an impressive sight. But as I say, James, they must have come to a land that, first of all, you had this sort of this almost understated apartheid. They're all already up against this sort of white superiority. Again, it's easy to say that through the lens of time, but at the time that was just the prevailing environment. That was the prevailing society where immigrants, other than white immigrants, were always looked down upon. So they again had this double challenge of not just trying to cope with the environment and cope with a pioneering situation, but also against the population, the white population, who essentially were in charge of society. They were trying to make a living and build a life against that context as well. So as we always say, James, these guys really were built of granite. These guys, they came from, a pretty tough background in the Punjab. but they've built their lives. They had this entrepreneurial spirit, and in whatever form, whether it's in the outback or whether it's on the coastal regions, they've managed to build their lives. And I would love to hear from any of our Sikh audience in Australia and of course in New Zealand. Let us know if you've got any stories about your previous generations. Are you first generation, second, or what? Let us know your stories in the comments. But yeah, I love these old stories, James, and it's always very educational because so few people know about the history in particularly areas like Australia, Canada, etc. We know so little about this diaspora and their history, certainly from the early days. But to me, it always makes great viewing, great listening.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you look at it in context, I mean, they were going into Australia almost 100 years before they were coming into Canada. And what achievements they've made here in Canada are phenomenal. So, basically double that in what they've contributed in Australia is just phenomenal. It's just very inspiring, Angus. And for those people who bitch and moan every day that, they're working, these low-paying jobs, well, think about this. These individuals traveled across countries or across oceans to try and make a better life for their families, but they also were taking jobs that paid even less than minimum wage in a lot of cases, and I'm talking modern day here. They're taking or getting, some type of exploitation from employers, and yet they're still finding the ability to send money home and support a family there while they try to at least meet their very basic needs here in Canada, in the UK, in the US and such. So, I mean, the work ethic and the overall personal ethics that they have are just, something that's overlooked in today's society by many.
Indeed, and of course that work ethic is one of the central tenets of Sikhi. It is to make an honest living, and that is certainly borne out by their efforts in places like Australia. So fascinating. Thanks for that, James. Yeah, right, let's move on and let's go from a nice positive story to another positive story, but about a negative subject. This, of course, is the story of transnational repression. Now, transnational repression has been widely recognised now, fortunately, because of India's, let's say, bad behaviour on the international stage. It has highlighted the fact of what they've been up to most Western governments. And, of course, the US government, the Canadian government particularly, have recognised this transnational repression for what it is, and they are actually taking and have taken pretty powerful and positive steps to deal with it. Now, of course, late to the party has been the British government. For whatever reasons, and we often talk about this and we often question why is the British government so reluctant almost to recognise, firstly, transnational repression, but secondly, to protect its own Sikh community, who have contributed so much within British society. So, but finally, I'm delighted to report that after fantastic lobbying once again by the British Sikh community, and again taking the vanguard of that is the Sikh Federation UK. The British government has formed a joint committee in Parliament. It is a joint committee on human rights. They are actually specifically have been briefed or have been given the brief to investigate transnational repression that's happening here in the UK. And heading this committee is a gentleman called David Patrick Paul Alton. He's Baron Alton of Liverpool. He's a British-Irish politician, and he was formerly a member of Parliament for the Liberal Party and the Lib Dems, and he then joined the House of Lords. So he's actually a Lord. He is Lord Alton, as he is known. But he was tasked to chair this committee to investigate transnational repression here in the UK. Now, as part of this committee, and it isn't, although one of the main contributors to this, of course, is India, it is, of course, looking at transnational repression from all around the world. It is looking at it as a general subject, but of course, India does form a very large part of this investigation. And Lord Alton did call upon all the various communities to say, look, we need evidence. Can you please provide evidence of what has been going on? And of course, the Sikh community have been very happy to oblige by providing reams of evidence. And I say reams, actually, it's a 32-page submission. So the Sikh Federation UK were more than happy to collate this evidence, and they submitted a 32-page document to this committee, and the committee have since been taking a look at it. And what they did say within the evidence, that here is all the evidence documented over a 40-year period of what the Indian government have been up to. And they have claimed under this document that it is the Indian government, and particularly under Narendra Modi, who have been the biggest and most aggressive perpetrator of transnational repression and foreign interference in the UK. And this is a view that's shared, of course, as we say, widely by Western security officials and human rights organisations all around the world. Now, one of the contributors in this committee, one of the speakers who was asked to again contribute, was a gentleman called Dr. Andrew Chubb. He is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at the University of Lancaster. He's also a graduate at the University of Western Australia. I'm going to play you a quick video that will highlight some of this. We'll cherry pick some of the best parts of this committee, so you can get a taste of what's been spoken about.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th meeting of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. It's part of our thematic inquiry into transnational repression. And I would say to those who are watching this online that the call for evidence is still open and the deadline is February the 24th. The committee welcomes evidence from individuals and groups and people who feel that they have been affected by transnational repression, and especially if they're resident here in the United Kingdom. Transnational repression is an evolving, cutting-edge human right, and it catches within its claws many people, from pro-democracy advocates to lawyers, sanctioned parliamentarians, journalists, political dissenters, opponents of totalitarian regimes, and many other people. We are interested in how transnational repression is understood as a concept, in how the United Kingdom government has been responding to threats and intimidation made on British soil, inadequacies in the referral mechanisms, the patchy way that different victims have been responded to, and international cooperation amongst democratic like-minded nations in responding to malign state actors, everyone from the theocratic dictatorship in Iran to the work of the United Front in China. With us today to help us understand these issues in far greater detail and to delve deeper into this whole question of transnational repression are three formidable expert witnesses.
Some of the smaller perpetrators, if you like, less prominent international actors at least, that members of the committee may well be already familiar with: Bahrain, Eritrea, Pakistan is another that's come out recently, and hopefully there will be some evidence to this inquiry concerning that particular case. Vietnam, there is, and even elements within democratic countries have been accused and reportedly involved in very serious acts of transnational repression. I'm thinking here of the Modi movement in India and the linkages with the murders of Sikh activists in Canada and the attempted murder in the United States as well.
The Sikh Federation UK has made a detailed 32-page submission to the Joint Committee for Human Rights. Evidence has been set out covering a 40-year period to show the Indian government under Narendra Modi is the biggest and most aggressive perpetrator of transnational repression and foreign interference in the UK. This view is now shared by Western security officials and human rights organisations.
So the big test, of course, James, is going to be when they collate their findings and produce their report, which I think is going to be pretty unambiguous, as say Narendra Modi's India gets a specific mention there in quite a powerful degree. What will the British government do about it? That will be the key test, James. So far, I would have to say, been pretty weak in their reaction and pretty disappointing. But when faced with this report, as I say, the real test, and we will have to judge on the British government's reaction to see if they actually do anything about it, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And the same can be said here in Canada with the Transnational Repression Commission and the reports that came out. Of course, now we are in a holding pattern, waiting to see who the next leader of the Liberal Party is going to be before the next step, which will be the election. So it's all just a big circle. It's going to be out of the news cycle by the time that the new leadership is in place here in Canada. And that leaves open the door, the same as it does in the UK. What is going to happen? What are the next steps? How are these leaders, such as Narendra Modi, going to be held accountable? And it was interesting that they brought up Eritrea, because I actually stumbled across, just inadvertently one day, a big protest that they were holding about the transnational repression and foreign interference by that nation here in Vancouver. So again, it is a widespread spread problem. But the bright side is that the UK did take the time and put the resources in to take a look at this serious problem and to name the India government specifically and really put that finger on Narendra Modi and say, you know what? We know that you are one of the worst perpetrators, one of the worst offenders. And again, he is getting called out by the world and not just Canada. So it helps to reinforce that he is taking these illegal steps and breaching sovereignty of foreign nations all around the globe, Angus, not just here in North America.
Indeed, and I hope Narendra Modi, well, not that he'll be watching this or taking any notice, but certainly to be called out in the same breath as Iran and Russia, etc. It's not a good look for a supposedly democratic country. So, good news anyway is that it has at last reached mainstream British politics. So that's very encouraging. Yeah. We will follow that with interest. Right, James, let's move on to my second story. And we reported last week how we talked quite a bit about these ICE raids, these immigration official raids on places of worship and the threat of this, and how the community, the Sikh community, had responded to this. And we did report that the Sikh community were actually taking legal action. They were joining a sort of a party action against the Trump administration, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, to try and legally prevent, to injunct these raids on places of worship. Now, this was it was a case that was started by the Quaker movement in the US. And of course, it's been joined by various other organisations as part of this sort of almost a class action. And Gurdwara in California joined this almost as a test case, really, to say, look, also our Gurdwaras, we fear that our Gurdwaras are going to be raided by the officials, the Department of Homeland Security. So we want a legal injunction to prevent them being able to do this. So it does appear that they have won this first step. This first legal step has been actually won because a judge has reported over the last day or two, by AP actually, that this first judge has now blocked this Trump immigration policy allowing arrests in churches for some religious groups. And as it reports, a federal judge blocked immigration agents from conducting enforcement operations in houses of worship for, and it specifically says, Quakers and a handful of other religious groups. And of course, it's the Quakers that took the head of this specific legal case. US District Judge Theodore Chang found that the Trump administration policy could violate their religious freedom and should be blocked while a lawsuit challenging it plays out. So basically, it's a temporary block, but it's basically saying, no, you've got to stop until the final lawsuit can actually be played out and a final judgment be made. So it is essentially, it is like an injunction saying we're going to temporarily hold it until a proper legal decision can be made. So this preliminary injunction from the judge only applies to the plaintiffs, of course, those people who specifically are involved in this case, which also includes a Georgia-based network of Baptist churches and the Sikh temple, or they call it a Sikh temple, at Sikh Gurdwara in California. Now, there are a few specific legal details of this, and the policy change said that field agents using common sense and discretion can conduct immigration enforcement operations at houses of worship without a supervisor's approval. Now, this is the key wording here. Previously, as the law stands in the US, is that any raid on any place of worship can take place but with a supervisor's approval. So somebody in a senior managerial role has to make that call. You can't just wade in. Low-level enforcement can't just wade in and make a raid. They've got to get approval from a senior level. this law change, this policy change that Trump has brought in, saying you don't need the supervisor's approval, low level, basically anybody in law enforcement can, on their arbitrary opinion, launch a raid. So that's the decision, that's the policy change that they're actually fighting. Now, the plaintiffs' attorneys, that's the Gurdwaras, argue that the new Department of Homeland Security directive departs from this 30-year-old policy against staging immigration operations in protected areas or sensitive locations. So they're saying it's actually breaking this 30-year policy. Now, many immigrants, as a result of this, and this I'll come on to this in a moment, but many immigrants are now afraid to attend religious services while the government enforces the new rules, and that's what the lawyers are arguing. But plaintiffs have provided no evidence, according to the Homeland Security. They're saying, look, no, you provided no evidence indicating that any of your religious organisations have been targeted. Now, also a similar lawsuit, but there's a completely separate lawsuit, has actually been launched in Washington as well. So these two cases are running concurrently. Now, government lawyers have argued, saying that immigration enforcement activities have been allowed in sensitive places, including houses of worship, for decades. And this has been going on for decades. The only change in policy is that a supervisor's approval is no longer mandatory. So the argument here, as I say, it comes back to this simple, it's a basic policy change. Where, as I said before, it's always required a manager's, in simple terms, a manager has got to overlook the whole case and say, yes, it's justified, or no, it's too sensitive. And that this policy change that the plaintiffs have been arguing and saying, no, you're changing this basic policy which gives us some degree of protection. In other words, somebody with a little bit more common sense and experience, a bit more professional experience can make this call, because of course it is so deeply offensive from a religious perspective. But more importantly, it is actually it is generating fear, and this violates the U.S. Constitution. And in the U.S. Constitution, it is written that there is this freedom to practice one's religion, whatever that religion is. And basically, what they're arguing, it is unconstitutional. And they have actually said, and in fact, NBC News did actually report around the same time that Sikh communities are now fearing that these immigration raids at Gurdwaras, as Trump ends his sanctuary for houses of worship, is actually putting people off. And there's a whole article providing evidence that people in the community are now not attending the Gurdwaras because they're fearing these immigration raids by the ICE teams. So there you go, James. It does go against the US Constitution. I do, to a degree, argue that, look, it is just a small policy change, and actually there has been the allowance, the legal allowance for ICE and immigration officials to invade Gurdwaras, but they will always only do it with a level of common sense. So that policy change is very subtle, but of course it has triggered all the religious communities to say, no, you've gone over a threshold here. We do need that managerial oversight. We do need somebody at a more senior level to make this call, because the cost of let's say, a clumsy low-level official of wading into a Gurdwara is too high. It can cause deep offence. It can cause, essentially, it generates fear, and it is putting people from our community off going to their places of worship, which is anti-constitutional. It is going against the US Constitution. So although the legal change is very subtle, and on the face of it, actually quite small, the impact is pretty large, James. So I think that this is the first case that they've won, and they're hoping, or it's an injunction basically, and they're hoping that this injunction will trigger the winning the whole case, which in turn will then be rolled out across the US, and the policy will revert back to the original policy that it does require managerial oversight from a senior official before these raids can be triggered, James.
Absolutely, but I think that what a bigger concern is that there's always been, what we see here is a very small change in written policy, but there's always been that unwritten policy, or that silent policy, that allowed sanctuary within the religious and houses of worship. And I think that is where people have gotten very comfortable with, because it has been that unwritten policy that they wouldn't cross that threshold. But again, that was an unwritten policy or an unwritten law. It was just kind of an understanding that was there. Now people are seeing that that may be infringed upon and taken steps further. And again, by people, as you said, Angus, that are not, maybe don't have the life and the job experience to really weigh the pros and the cons of entering into a house of worship for these reasons, and whether or not the reasons are strong enough to dictate that entry, or whether or not there could be other ways to work with the administration of the house of worship to, find other ways to deal with it. One of the other concerns, of course, is that whether it is in the Gurdwaras or in temples or other locations, sometimes there are medical clinics, there are food pantries, there are immigration consultants, and different services like this that may be very valued or very needed by certain members of the community who now they may be afraid to go there, and could have impacts on health, on safety, on food security or other things. So yeah, it's trying to balance the constitutional rights, the laws, and both the written and the unwritten understandings that have been there historically to keep that trust and that cooperation between the community and the government. So again, it's going to be worth watching, Angus, how it plays out in the long term.
Yeah, we will, of course, follow that lawsuit, and when they come to their conclusions, we will, of course, report on those. Let's move on now to our comments section, and Pritam Korban will start us off today with, this is a comment, I'm assuming, relating to the deportees. These are Sikhs who were deported back to India from the US. And we did say that, of course, in this case, it's been going on about their dastars, their turbans being forcibly removed. Well, as Pritam Korban says, but they also handcuffed them. Of course, yes, they did actually, I think, have to suffer the ignominy of being deported and being repatriated back to India, also handcuffed. So, unfortunately, a pretty uncomfortable ride for them, James, I would say.
Yeah, and it goes beyond handcuffing, Angus. They actually shackled them. So that means that they are handcuffed at the wrists, handcuffed at the ankles, with a link chain in between, a belt that goes around the waist. So they're actually very, very restricted in the movement. And then the shackles and everything are actually then attached to a locking mechanism on the plane. And they aren't airplane seats like you see on British Airways or on American Airlines. These are very uncomfortable military seats. They're not built for comfort. They're not made to be able to enjoy or for enjoyment. They are just purpose-developed seats, and they are uncomfortable for these individuals. And again, they take it further than just the handcuffs. They are fully shackled and locked to the cabin, and that's why I think that it's an overreach or a real overreaction to take away turbans, because they're so restricted movement anyway. They're not going to be able to do anything with them.
Indeed. So next time I travel in cattle class, I won't be so loudly complaining about how uncomfortable I am, because it could be an awful lot worse. 5 AAB comments. Now, this is an interesting comment about the endemic corruption within India. It is sizable, as 5 AAB reports. It starts from the security guy, or peon, as they're called, and it goes all the way up to the Prime Minister. Nothing gets done without heating someone's palm, as you say. For example, he went to his land records. There's a fee of 50 rupees, an additional charge of 1,000 rupees. If you want it the same day, another 1,000 rupees. You want a driving license, which are free, but the guy who gives it will ask for 100 rupees. And you ask why, he'll say, we've run out, come back tomorrow. The same thing will happen tomorrow or the day after until you pay 100 rupees. And as you say, I've noticed that today an Indian carries an extra number to complete the DNA chain. So it's embedded in the genes. If a person in position doesn't like Rishvat, he or she is seen as abnormal. Wow, clearly it runs all the way through Indian society from the very bottom to the very top. And I often say I worked in Nigeria a lot, and I saw exactly the same thing. It is so endemic. And the story I often report was when I went to the toilet in the airport and I went to wash my hands. A young boy ran out, turned the tap on for me, and then put his hand out and went 100, whatever, I forget the currency now, and demanded money. And that just made me realise just how endemic corruption can embed itself into a society. And once the top do it, it moves down, because those at the bottom think, oh, well, everybody at the top's doing it, so it's okay for me to do it. And it just literally becomes part of society. It is an evil that just corrodes society, James.
Absolutely. And I mean, it is just rampant in India, whether or not it's in government, in private enterprise, or even just out on the streets. I mean, you see people who are actively recruiting people who have physical disabilities so they can make themselves flowers on a street corner and basically give them pennies on every dollar that they sell. I mean, just the corruption and the abuses are just never ending, and that's just another example.
Yeah, so thank you for that fascinating insight into how deeply corrupt Indian society is. Very interesting. Goldwing, we talked about Deep Sidhu and the party of Deep Sidhu, and you suggest, is it possible to bring Reena Roy, Deep Sidhu's girlfriend, to a USA court to bring justice for Deep Sidhu? As you rightly say, she was the main eyewitness. She was there on scene. She knows the truth of what really happened. And then you say she was quickly shifted to the USA by Indian agencies and the deep state. I have to say, I don't know much about her. I don't really know much about her story. And it's interesting that you say she was shifted out of India very quickly. I think that in itself, James, implies an awful lot. Why was India so keen to get her out of the country? I think we can probably guess. Unfortunately, you say bring her to court in the US. The US has no jurisdiction. If this case happened, the accident happened in India, then there's nothing that can be done. Unfortunately, it's got to happen in situ. It's got to happen where the accident happened. So, unfortunately, as deeply frustrating it is, I don't think that the US government can do anything about it other than raise the case of it, raise the profile of it, just bring it to the public attention.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the advantage for her would be in the media to really get international exposure and put pressure that way. But as you said, in the U.S. there is no court of jurisdiction. The legal system really cannot take any type of stand against a foreign nation on foreign soil. So again, her best opportunity being in the U.S. is to use that media machine to her advantage. But again, how much of it is Modi controlled as well at the end of the day when you bring on stories against or that have a negative connotation towards the Indian government?
Yeah, and the thought did occur to me likewise, is that she does know exactly what happened. Why has she not spoken out? Now, there are two reasons. One is that maybe it genuinely was a car accident, and she knows it was, in which case it's, again, deeply frustrating that is the case. But secondly, it may be that she's scared. Maybe she does know the truth. The truth is too dangerous to come out in public domain, and she has possibly been threatened, or at least knows that if she speaks out, her life could equally be in danger. So it may well be she has been intimidated into silence, James.
And that's just it, right? I mean, we all know how much of a reach India has, and that definitely can reach into the U.S. We know it can. We've seen it. It's proven. So it could be that, yeah, as you say, she could be under threat of intimidation or physical violence. So could definitely be, Angus.
Yeah. Gurdwaras Singh Pannu, Think and Unite, is absolutely convinced that God is with Gurdwaras Singh Pannu. He may well be. The Hindu Indian government and supporters will face God's punishment. Eternal hell waits for them. Well, that's up to God, not ourselves, to make that call, but I'm sure God will have his own opinion, or her opinion. But interestingly, Danny responds, as Danny often does. And interestingly, Danny let us know that he's a Hindu, a practicing Hindu, which is actually very interesting to know that in the context of his response. Because he says, look, if God is with Pannu, why did he not stay and fight on the land he talks about? Why did he run thousands of miles away to land stolen from Red Indians, indigenous people? Well, I'm going to leave that Red Indian side argument aside. That's a whole different discussion. But the point is say, why did he flee the Punjab and is now spouting in the United States? Well, the answer to that, as we often say, Danny, is very simple. It is because it is too dangerous for him to stay in the Punjab. Can you imagine if Gurdwaras Singh Pannu campaigned for khalistan in the Punjab, when I only reported just the other day, two guys were arrested and imprisoned for several years for putting up posters about the referendum. You imagine if Panoon had been there actually fighting for the referendum itself in person. It's very likely that he would not be around to speak anymore. And even in the US, he's not safe. We do know that we've uncovered this assassination plot from the Indian government to silence him. So unfortunately, Danny, and again, this is a view that I have to say, unfortunately, it is a view that's probably been shaped by the Govt media. I don't actually know where you're based, but certainly the Govt media has given this narrative that, of course, the Hindu population have quite happily lapped up about Gurbajan Singh Panoon and about the Khalistan movement and it being a fringe movement, etc., and they're all terrorists. Well, Panoon is not a terrorist, but he has to practice his democratic right of free speech in the United States because he cannot safely do it in the Punjab. It's as simple as that. That's the answer, I'm afraid, James.
Absolutely, and let's not overlook or forget the fact that not only does he have to have that communication with the Sikh diasporas around the world, so that it would also be restricted if he was within the confines of the India borders, because of the fact that they can shut off that communication very easily. And then you take into fact that there also has to be a public campaign towards other nations to bring awareness of what Khalistan is, what it is about, the history, the formation, the future, the policies. All of these things make a difference in the international world, in the world of politics and international organizations such as the United Nations, when it comes time to recognize Khalistan as a free, sovereign, and independent nation of Sikhs. So that is also an important issue. And if he was inside the confines, once again, of India, the access to bring that awareness to those international politicians and organizations would be very much restricted as well, reducing the support on the international stage for Khalistan and the recognition of Khalistan when it happens, Angus.
Indeed. But thank you, Danny, for your contribution once again. An interesting contribution.
Yeah.
And final set, Satbat Chan Singh says, nice to hear the Truth Twins, James. I think it was referring to us. I always enjoy your programme. Well, we always enjoy your comments. Thank you. But we are the Truth Twins, James.
It reminds me of the old cartoon there with the monkeys and the rings, you know, the twin powers activated. And then they turned into airplanes or something. I don't remember. It's an old cartoon from my childhood.
And TC also thanks us for bringing us the news and much needed educational content. Keyword there, educational. Well, we are learning just as much of our audience are. It's been a fascinating journey for us. But of course, the word there, the keyword is truthful reporting. And I refer to all our commenters who call it propaganda. All we're trying to do is bring you the truth. Truthful reporting dedicated to your audience. Indeed, that is important. We do dedicate everything to our audience. We couldn't do this show without you, our wonderful audience, and your wonderful feedback, which is always appreciated. And of course, the feedback from those who criticise us or those who have a differing narrative. We are delighted to talk about the differing narratives and have that debate, have that discussion, James.
Absolutely. And just to jump back to the previous story or the previous remark there, Angus, about the fighting from inside India or outside. And it just occurred to me, you know, like with the forest fires we see every year, we don't put the forest fires in the middle of the flames and say, fight your way out. We take them out of the danger zone and let them fight from the outside to work towards the center. So again, just a little analogy for you. But no, absolutely. And we appreciate, back to this comment, we always appreciate all of the support from our fans, from our followers, and from our viewers, even if they're only one or two-time viewers. Leave your comments because that really keeps us going and really helps with the algorithm, as well as the fact that we just love to interact with everybody that's a part of the show. And that's mostly you, the viewers.
Indeed. And the final comment, which I think is a really deep comment, and it's an important comment, this is from user DD1 something or other. Thank you so much, brothers, for bringing in lighter truth to the dark side of cruelty. It is an absolute pleasure and an honour, as we always say. But I think this is what's important about this comment. It is very easy to think when you sit on one side of an argument, it's quite often you can feel quite lonely because it's particularly when there is an overwhelming narrative that is pushed by a powerful force. it is very easy to feel that you're alone, that you are sitting in this dark place and you are the only one who thinks this way, and you do feel lonely and a little bit afraid. That is how these powerful regimes operate. They drive people who hold the opposite view into the dark corners, and they feel lonely, they feel afraid, they're too afraid to stand up. But, and actually a great comparison of this is things like Brexit and things like this, the big political arguments that happened over here in the UK. Many people who've sat on sides of the discussion, of the debate, have often felt alone. They think, oh, I must be the only person who thinks like this. And we remain silent. You're almost too afraid to speak in public about your views because you think, I must be in the minority. I must be just one of the very few people who think like this. So you stay silent. But when somebody stands up and speaks on your behalf, suddenly it empowers you. You feel this great sense of, I am not alone. It is not just me that thinks like this. And this is the Khalistan movement in a nutshell. There are many, many, many people who are pro-Khalistan, despite what the Indian media tell you, despite what this enormously powerful regime of India try and tell you. The Khalistan movement is not a small fringe minority movement. They are not terrorists who live in the shadows. They are actually a powerful, large number of people who feel the same way. So don't feel that you are alone. Don't feel that you are in the minority. You are not. There are millions of people in the diaspora and indeed in the Punjab who feel the same way. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to stand up and speak your mind. Do not be afraid to stand up for what Khalistan stands up for. You are not alone, James. That is the message that we must get across. Do not believe the Govt media. You are not alone. We are many.
Absolutely. And believe it or not, folks, there are a lot more than just these two pasty white guys that support you on the other side as well. So outside of the Sikh community, you have great support as well from pasty white guys just like Angus and I all over the world.
Indeed. So thank you, user DD, for that really powerful comment. And it does highlight this point to remind people in the community, you are not alone. Do not be afraid. Do not feel that you are alone in your feelings. There are probably many, many, many more people who share your own personal views. So never be afraid. Never be intimidated. But on that note, unfortunately, we must leave perspectives for another day. Please don't forget to keep those comments coming in. There's been some fantastic comments coming in, so do please keep those up, especially the educational and informative comments. And of course, our Critics Corner has been rather light of late. So please, if you disagree with us, please don't be afraid in holding back. Do let us know your thoughts if you disagree with us. But also, you can message us directly at message@satlodgetv.com if there's anything you'd like to bring to our attention that you don't want to put in the public domain. But that is perspectives ended for another day. Thank you so much for watching. It is a goodbye from me. It is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.